Imagine arriving at the gate of that colony, still breathing as if the world outside the wall hadn't completely forgotten you. You don't yet know that the smell will crawl into your skin. An old woman sits at the corner of a narrow alley, her body folded by time. Her face is half gone, wrapped in a cloth that is no longer white. But no one can leave. And more than that, no one wants to enter. Outsiders speak of them with fearful tones, as if merely mentioning the name of this place could make the disease travel through speech. So they refer to it vaguely. The silent place, the house of wounds, or simply point to the direction the wind comes from. They send food by carts left at the gates. Then they retreat, believing they fulfilled compassion, but there are no embraces, no messages that say a name. She doesn't beg. She only stares at the ground, as if nothing in the world is worth looking at anymore. It's like water dripping slowly onto already cracked stone. Days are only marked by who was buried this morning and who began coughing last night. There are no church bells ringing, no markets, no children running. Only the sound of insects who love dead flesh and whispers from one bed to another, wondering whether there will be breath left to draw tomorrow. At the end of another corridor, a young boy with one arm tied to his body stands silently, his eyes wide. He does not cry. Here, tears have lost their meaning. Those who live within this colony no longer ask why. They simply wait for time to move far enough that their names no longer need to be remembered by anyone. A smell that can't be described simply as foul. It's a blend of overboiled meat, sour mud, aged pus, and something that was once alive but now rots slowly. The wind carries that scent from afar, even before you see the main building where the castaways dwell. Its walls are low and rough, as if they were never truly finished. Weeds grow wild among the stone foundations, and behind a heavy, black-painted wooden door, another world waits. A world that accepts no one except those who have lost the right to hope. There is no sound in that colony except coughing, limping footsteps, and sometimes faint screams that no longer resemble human voices. You might think a place like this would be filled with despair. But what will surprise you is how quiet that despair is. It does not scream. It does not rage. It only sits like a thin smoke hovering over almost dead embers. There are songs still sung by those who remember how sound can warm the chest. But the melodies are always low, broken, as if the world itself refuses to listen. In a dark room, a man with rotting fingers writes poetry on a stone wall with charcoal. His lines are simple, about his mother, about the memory of eating warm soup, about the night before everything changed. Then he sleeps, and perhaps does not wake again. A 14th century leper colony is not merely a place of exile. It is a prison without guards. There are no iron bars, and for those living behind the walls, time does not flow gently. Night in a leper colony is not like night in any village. It does not arrive slowly with calming winds. It falls like a heavy cloak, covering everything in a piercing silence. There are no clean clothes, no scent of soap. Their bodies smell like damp earth, long buried, and even when the cold air bites, they say little. A former priest becomes a teacher, drawing letters in the dirt with a stick. There is no cross on the wall. Only a piece of brown cloth hung with a simple knot. There is no blood on the walls or screams that echo. But what you will feel is a horror far more silent. The horror of a life suspended. Of humans still breathing, but already considered dead. Of love that cannot be shown, and wounds that cannot be escaped. You will see them, sitting, staring blankly, inhaling the same air as you. And you will realize that an hour there is enough to fracture your soul. But prayers are still offered. Not for healing, because they know that hope has long gone out, but for strength to survive one more day. To be given dreams without shadows, to be given a smile from someone, even once, before the end comes. There is no blackboard, no school bell, Tia, but there is still intent to remain human. Amidst all the ruin, the most touching are those who still try to laugh. Laughter that is broken and faint, but still there. Perhaps because at the edge of unbearable pain, there are only two choices: drown in silence, or try to sing among the rubble. There are no talks of the future, because the future was stolen by the diagnosis. They speak only of what they can still remember. The river where they once bathed. Their mother's face before it faded, the taste of bread that used to be crisp. Memory becomes the only comfort, and also the punishment, because to remember is to know that all of it is gone. No lamps are lit because oil is scarce, and light only comes from a dim moon or a flickering flame caught by the wind. An old man with rotting legs still tries to feed his blind friend. There is no complaint, no shouting, only slow movements and attention wrapped in silence. In the outside world, love is often declared with words and gifts. But here, love comes as a cup of water offered without request, or a silent embrace on a nearly ruined body. But more than the darkness, the night brings a quiet fear. A fear without a face, yet always present. Behind rickety doors held shut with stones, people hold themselves close, listening to the breath of someone they love, growing heavier with each passing night. Elsewhere, the sound of crying is no longer heard. Here, death comes slowly, and grief is too tired to announce it. Their clothes are patches of old fabric sewn so many times that their original colors are forgotten. You will see how they care for each other, not because there is hope for healing, but because it is the only thread of humanity left. They build families out of shared suffering. A widow with 3 fingers still intact becomes the mother to 2 orphans who no longer know their real names. And every week, if the sky is not too angry, they gather in a room that was once a storeroom. They call it a chapel. So if you come to that colony, do not expect to see horror like in paintings. Mourning in the leper colony is not a beginning. It is not a rising or a fresh hope. It is merely a continuation of a night that never truly ended. There are no chasing games, no bursts of laughter in the air. They simply sit still, staring at pebbles or watching adults grow wearier by the day. These children are born of separation, growing within the walls of isolation, never knowing the world outside. What is surprising is when someone survives longer than expected. An old man who still laughs despite half his face peeling away. but because they are too human to forget. Those who live among the ruins of hope, yet still manage to share a hint of a smile. Those cast aside by the world, yet welcome you without suspicion. You will realize that the greatest suffering is not the wound on the body, but forgetting what it feels like to be loved. A young woman who continues to embroider on ragged cloth, stitching flowers no one will ever see. In a world left behind by history. Courage does not come from swords or banners, but from hands still tending to wounds and hearts still trying to dream. Some do not even realize that what they experience is not normal. About rivers that still flow, about music that can be heard without fear. Because here, what is more valuable than anything is the reminder that the world is not always like this, that beyond the colony walls, life still moves without shame, without stigma, without wounds cared for in silence. They think everyone lives with wounds that never heal and fingers that vanish one by one. In a narrow, silent world, imagination becomes the only place they can go. A thin fog lingers between the rickety huts like smoke from something long extinguished. There is no crowing of roosters, no busy footsteps to the fields. Only dry coughing and dragging footsteps from legs struggling to support a body. Some try to sit outside, letting the faint light dance on their cracked skin. But not because they wish to enjoy the morning. They simply want to know if their bodies can still move, still feel the cold, still be alive. Children here do not play. Elsewhere, the communal kitchen begins to emit thin steam from a large clay pot. Not because food is ready, but because the water has started to boil. Eyes that remain shut even when light enters. And those bodies are carried to the back, to dry ground already filled with nameless gravestones. There is not enough wood to make markers, so they remember locations by stories. Near the small leaning tree, beside the large stone shaped like a heart. But even memories fade slowly, like the bodies dissolving into the earth. There is no meat, no spices. Only thin gruel made from leftover grains planted with hands that can barely grip a hoe. They eat not out of hunger, but because the body demands something to continue. A small bowl is handed out, with a wooden spoon passed from hand to hand. No one complains, though there is almost no flavor. Perhaps they have forgotten what it feels like to be full. Every day, someone goes, not always with weeping or ceremony. Sometimes, only silence. A body that does not wake again. Death is not surprising here. If you come bearing donations, they will not ask for clothes or money. They will ask for stories. Stories about villages that still make noise. So you will return carrying a burden no one can see. Faces that remain in your mind, not because they are frightening. The days in the colony were a lesson in how time could move without direction. There was no fixed work, no defined purpose. People simply waited. Waited for the pain to ease. Waited for the body to surrender. Waited for news from the outside world that might never arrive. There were no stairs leading to freedom. Only a heavy wooden door that always remained shut. When the fires went out and wind slipped through cracks in the walls, the sound of crying was often heard. A child singing an old tune in a quiet voice. a mother fixing a stranger's blanket, a man still combing his hair, though half bald. Tiny things proving that even though their bodies were abandoned, their souls still longed to live as humans. In a colony shunned and feared, life still tried to grow, even if only in the form of whispers, embraces, and names remembered. Not because of wounds, but because of loneliness. In the dark, fear took new shapes. The fear that they would die and never be remembered. The fear that their faces would fade from memory, even by their own children. Some tried to write their names on stone with charcoal, but rain and time were always stronger. So they began to write them into each other's hearts, memorizing little names, retelling their life stories while sitting beneath a dry tree. Because if the names kept being spoken, maybe they were not completely gone. In the distance, their home villages might still stand, but none would be welcomed back if they returned. Some sent letters, scrawling words on worn paper passed through the priest. But replies were rare, because no one wanted to remember them. Their names were erased from family trees, from citizen registries, even from weekly prayers. They became living ghosts, simply unacknowledged. Sometimes a visitor from the town's church would arrive, bearing a cross and a bit of holy water, offering prayers and whispers of forgiveness. But after they left, the silence returned heavier than before. No one really knew why they were sent here. Some weren't even sure if they were truly sick. But once your body entered this place, the world no longer cared about right or wrong. Only silence and exile remained. The caretakers, if they could be called, that were not medical professionals. They were fellow sufferers whose conditions were slightly better. They walked slowly, carrying gauze, salty water, and a drop of courage. Wounds were cleaned not to heal, but to smell less foul. Sometimes care came only in the form of a soft whisper, a touch on the shoulder, or a hug that families never had the chance to offer. They knew most would never leave this place, so they did not build hope. They only tried to slow the collapse. The colony walls were not just stone and wood. They were a boundary between a world deemed clean and a world left to rot. Night brought a deeper fear. And among all that suffering, small, nearly invisible moments of beauty would sometimes appear. When the rain came, the ground inside the colony turned to sticky mud. The path from the main gate to the small huts became a stream of filth and puddles reflecting the gray sky. These stories came from priests or town officials who stopped by briefly. But the stories were like shadows of dreams. They never touched life behind these walls. They grew up with limited language and the same view every day. The laughter sounded dry, but also sincere. Because among undeniable suffering, humans still searched for a crack to remain human. Only piles of dirt and maybe a piece of wood that lasted a few weeks before crumbling. But the dead were never truly gone from the colony. Their names were whispered at night. Their stories were retold like small legends passed from one patient to another, because what was most feared was not death, but being forgotten. And if someone still speaks your name, then you still live a little in this world. They shared food, even if it was only a handful of porridge. They sat in circles, telling stories about youth, about lovers they never got to marry, about old songs they used to sing together. Their laughter was a form of defiance against a world that had rejected them. A form of resistance against being forgotten. They learned to recognize the smell of wounds before they learned to read. They prayed not for safety, but to avoid being chosen as the next to die. Some of them had a strong will to live, playing with stones, scribbling on walls with charcoal, making toys from wood scraps. But even so, childhood in the colony was not a full childhood. It was a long wait before the losses began. Not all children made it to adulthood, and even those who did carried wounds not seen on their skin. They were like looking at the world from the bottom of a well small and far. Even the sound of roosters crowing from the nearby village felt like mockery. Because a new day didn't mean a new beginning here. It only marked that another day had been survived. And survival was the only achievement permitted. Some sufferers still tried to walk slowly, even though their feet were swollen and covered in sores. There were no proper shoes, only pieces of cloth tied around their ankles. They walked not because they had somewhere to go, but because sitting still hurt too much. The cold air stiffened their joints, and even the smallest movement could distract them from the pain of being forgotten. In one hut, an old man sat hugging his knees, staring outside as if hoping to see something different from all the days before. But nothing changed. Only the world outside kept turning without them. Sometimes, stories from the outside world would reach them. Stories about markets still bustling, about churches still filled with prayers, about weddings and births. Children born in the colony never knew the world outside. People sometimes tried to laugh. They made jokes about the bad smell, about rats bold enough to steal food from human hands, about teeth falling out before hair. Time kept moving. People came and went, though most only left in one direction to a small grave behind the wall. There no tombstones stood. This is what it was like to be locked in a room with 99 other people, each with a different face, but soon all faces would become the same. Nighttime in the colony was another world. No lamp was bright enough to distinguish one face from another. In the deep silence, sometimes a rough cough could be heard, or a stifled groan. In some huts, people didn't sleep at all, just stared at the sky that couldn't be seen, waiting for dawn or a miracle, whichever arrived first. Those who could still sleep would dream, but even dreams rarely offered escape. For even in sleep, the shadow of exile lingered. Some would awaken with a soft cry, calling out to a mother, a child, or simply whispering to God in a voice no louder than a breath. The priests who sometimes came brought prayers, not answers. They taught that this suffering was a test, that this isolation was part of a divine plan. But behind hollow eyes, not everyone fully believed. For when pain becomes routine, faith begins to wear thin, like thread stretched too far. Even so, many still prayed. Not for healing, for that hope had long been replaced by reality. But to die in peace, not to be left alone, to be seen as human, even just once before everything ended. There are sounds of the night that can only be heard in a place like this. The soft scratching of nails against wounds that have not healed, the dragging of straw sandals across dirt floors, the heavy breathing that carries more than just fatigue. Between the dilapidated huts, the night wind carries a scent that cannot be described with words. They make small marks on the stone walls, one for each sunrise. But they soon realize that counting days only adds to the burden. They set down the baskets and quickly back away, as if afraid that the shadow of a leper might leap from behind the fence and cling to their skin. As if the world forgets to breathe. In that silence, many lie awake, staring at the thatched roof slowly cracking with age. They think about death, not as a fear, but as a door. Not an exit, but a return. Because in a place like this, the only direction that makes sense is inward. Not toward the outside world that has shut itself off, but into the depth of oneself, where memories and old dreams are buried along with wounds that never healed. Sometimes the food is spoiled, sometimes it has already turned, but no one complains, 'cause here even spoiled food can feel like love. Hands darkened by time and wounds do not hesitate to accept it. In a world where no one wants you, even scraps of food are reminders that you are still alive, still capable of hunger, still able to chew. Because each mark is a sign that they are still here, still not gone, still not finished. So the walls are left blank again. No calendars, no celebrations. Only time passing without identity. In the quiet, many remember the small things they once had. The scent of their mother's kitchen, the sound of the village church on Sunday mornings, or the feeling of grass beneath bare feet. Memories so small, yet they feel like belongings of an entirely different world. A world now only remembered, never reached. A mixture of damp earth, old sweat, festering wounds, and something that resembles fear. Not a repelling smell, but one that marks this place as different. It no longer belongs to any village, nor to any town. It is a space where time rots and people become shadows of what they once remembered themselves to be. The elderly who walk with difficulty lean on their sticks not to go farther, but simply to remain upright for one more day. The children, if any, are still lucky enough to run, play in silence. Without laughter, without calling each other's names. They toss stones into small holes they dig themselves, as if trying to bury something unseen by adults. In such silence, even a single sentence feels like a surprise. Words become precious. Not because they don't want to speak, but because many no longer know what to say. Some longtime residents try to keep track of time. The workers who occasionally bring food never step further than the gate. There is a moment in the night, just after the last cough fades and before the distant crow of a stray rooster, when everything seems to stop. Some nights feel heavier than others. The air becomes denser, as if each breath carries an unseen burden. Inside dimly lit huts, bodies lie in silence, but their minds keep moving, wandering through the quiet corridors of memory. Some try to remember the face of their mother. Others try to imagine the sound of the river they once crossed in childhood. But the harder they try, the more it all fades. Like dreams dissolving when eyes open, those memories slowly melt away, replaced by the sound of an empty stomach and the silent sting of persistent pain. Some of them were once farmers. Their hands once gripped hoes and planted hope across vast fields. Now, those hands are wounded, swollen, and numb. They no longer plant anything, only endure on soil they did not choose. Some were once craftsmen, making chairs or roof tiles or comfortable leather shoes. Now, there are no more orders, no more markets, and no reason to create. Creativity has been replaced by the constant silence that embraces them like fog. All that remains are surviving bodies and eyes that hold their own private worlds. Sometimes, there are small burials behind the fence. No coffins, just tattered cloth and a shallow hole. No ceremony, no prayers, just a few hands placing stones as markers. Often the person being buried is not named, not out of forgetfulness, but because saying a name feels too heavy. A name can summon tears. A name can make the chest feel full. So they learn silence. Even mourning is learned, so it doesn't hurt too much. In this place, even death must be accepted like spoiled breakfast. Silent, quick, and without choice. The quietest nights are not when everyone is asleep. They are when no one makes a sound, but every eye is open. That is when the soul speaks the loudest, and fear becomes real. Fear that tomorrow will not be different from today. Fear of being forgotten. That the world has moved on without them. And more than that, the fear that they too will forget what it feels like to be loved, to be touched, or simply to be acknowledged. 'Cause in a place like this, the first thing to die is not the body, but hope. There was a day when a child arrived. It was brought hastily from a distant village. His mother had died on a wet night due to a high fever. He could not walk far, only crawl and sit quietly. They had once laughed and gotten angry, once fallen in love and known loss. They still thought about gardens, clothes, and weddings. They might have heard about the leper colony, but only like a dark fairy tale. A place they never visited. A world they rejected so they could feel safe in their chosen ignorance. They did not want to know that beyond that wall, there were people who waited not for healing, but simply to be acknowledged as human. But now, all of that had been eroded by time and the stench of wounds that never healed. No letters came, no news from the outside, and if anyone asked, no one knew the month or the year. In this colony, time wasn't measured by clocks or calendars, but by who was still sitting and who was no longer there. Even cries had stopped eventually, not because the pain was gone, but because they had run out of voices. But every night he moved closer to the old woman who sat at the farthest end, once a cook in a nobleman's house. The woman had lost all her teeth, walked with a limp, and her eyes were clouded, but she knew how to gently pat a back. She knew how to break the silence with short tales of soups she used to make from leftover chicken bones and garlic. The child didn't understand all her words, but her voice felt like an embrace, like a lost home, like a world that might still be safe, even just for a moment. And there was no one left to care for the little one whose body had already started to show signs. They brought him to this colony with trembling hands and hearts that had already surrendered to despair. The child did not cry. He just stared blankly, his eyes unable to grasp the new world that was silent and full of strange gazes. He sat in the corner of an old building, wrapped in a worn cloth that was too thin to protect him from the biting night air. People watched him from a distance, not because they didn't care, but because they were afraid. Afraid of what the child might bring. Afraid of the mirror of their own lost childhood, buried in disease and exile. A few days later, the child was still alive, but his body grew weaker. Everyone in that place had once been someone. Not just a name on a list, not just a number in the city's ledger. Elsewhere, beyond the dividing wall, people lived in a different world. They still lit candles for dinner. In the cold of night, when her skin covered in spots and wounds that refused to heal, yet her eyes held a strange light. She did not laugh, only the clothes on their backs, but not a single prayer was sent toward the colony. Inside the walls that severed the world, humans turned into a kind of spirit trapped between life and death. Not healthy enough to return home, not weak enough to leave entirely. So they waited, day by day, year by year, until the world truly forgot they had ever existed. And though their bodies rotted and peeled away, they still embraced each other on quiet nights. Not out of love, but because the cold could not be endured alone. One or two small items, like a wooden rosary or a letter whose ink had faded. But they brought blackening skin, peeling flesh, and unhealed wounds. They brought shame that was never truly theirs. And most painfully, they brought names slowly forgotten. After a few weeks, no one called each other by name. They became voices, shadows, and breath. And when one finally stopped breathing, no one cried loudly. Only silence. Only a body gently carried to the dry ground, covered with stones or an old door. And forgotten as if it had never existed. But she also did not give up. She liked to walk slowly, every morning, circling the edge of the colony as if daring the wall to fall. Sometimes she carried wildflowers that grew near the ditch, placing them in front of the door of the building that held those who had passed. There were no funerals, only smell, only silence. But the flower was like a memory, a soft whisper that someone had been here, had lived even in suffering unworthy of history's ink. The sky showed no stars, and the wind carried only the scent of damp earth and drying wounds. The colony felt like a slow nightmare written by a forgotten world. Small sounds sometimes echoed, like mutters in sleep or the final breath held too long, behind a rotting building whose walls were covered in mold. Two old men sat in silence. They no longer needed to speak. They had seen everything, lost everything, and kept memories like torn cloth bags. Food came from nowhere. Occasionally, a cart would be tossed from the outside, with hard bread and scraps of meat even a dog might hesitate to touch. But they kept living. Not because of hope, but because the human body can endure longer than it should, when there is no other choice but to keep breathing. Among them was a young woman. Those who arrived at the colony did not bring much. Outside, church bells still rang. There was once a small child who arrived with his mother at the colony, brought in a horse-drawn cart pulled by an animal that could barely stand. His mother cried the entire way, But her tears stopped once they passed a heavy wooden gate guarded by two old men whose eyes no longer held light. The child didn't he know why they had come, or why everyone he saw looked like wet shadows stuck to the wall of time. He was still young enough to hope, but the world around him was too silent to answer. They stayed in the corner of a room with a leaking roof. Every night, the sounds of rats and the wind replaced any kind of bedtime story. His mother grew thin like a twig. Her skin lost its color. Her eyes lost their shape. The child began to play alone, drawing with charcoal on the dirt floor, creating another world that might be kinder. One that didn't exile people just because they were ill. People in the colony didn't blame God directly, but they no longer said his name either. Now only wild grass and thorny bushes remained. But a few people still sat there, facing the shy morning sun. They let the light touch their burnt and ruined skin, not to heal, but simply to feel that the sky was still there, even if the world had left. Someone once said with a raspy voice that in a place like this, love does not disappear. It only changes shape. It becomes a lingering gaze that holds longer than it should. It becomes a soft touch on a wounded shoulder. It becomes the bitter truth that even in exile's farthest edge, humans still search for meaning. Not because they had lost faith, but because their prayers had drowned too often in the quiet depths of long nights without answer. They learned that the simplest hope was not healing, but that tomorrow's pain would not be worse than today's. And when a body fell to the earth, they didn't ask why. They only asked who was next. Each day became a page without date, filled with routines, too quiet to be called life, too long to be called death. Outside the walls, people kept building, trading, and making history, but none of it was for them. They had been erased, replaced by a silence as sticky as frost on a gravestone. Behind the main building was a small garden that might once have been filled with flowers. Not everyone came to the colony because their bodies were broken. Some came because the world outside was crueler than the illness within. There was a young woman cast out because her husband wanted to marry her sister-in-law. They didn't know that another world outside the walls lived in color and sound. They had no coffins, just shallow holes dug near the stone fence. No names were written, only stones or branches laid as markers. But everyone remembered, because in a place forgotten by history, memory of each other was the last inheritance. Those still alive would walk slowly past the grave each morning. They didn't cry, they just stood silent. And in that silence, there was a respect deeper than any poem or prayer. They learned to read from tattered pages found in the ruins of an old chapel. They learned to count from grains arranged on the ground. And they learned to love from people who lived with half a face and half a hope. There were no mirrors in that colony. No one wanted to look back. The future was a dream sewn from the fabric scraps of the past, and the present was a wound not yet dressed. But strangely, beneath all that, there was a calm that couldn't be explained, like a cloudy sky that never rains, like someone coughing through the night, yet you sleep soundly because you know they're still alive. She had no wounds on her skin, but society gave her wounds no one could see. There was an old man who once owned land. But when the harvests failed and his debts mounted, he was condemned and labeled a curse-bearer. The colony became a final place, not just for the sick, but for those deemed unworthy by a world that wanted to remain clean and comfortable. They all ended up sitting together, sharing stories, scraps of food, and silence. For in such a place, silence is the only language that offends no one. Children grew up in strangeness. When death came, it arrived like an old friend too tired to hide. There were no screams, no last embraces. It's only shortening breaths and trembling hands that eventually calmed. Night in the leper colony was not like any night outside. There were no lanterns lit boldly. Light was too expensive and too likely to attract curiosity from beyond the walls. Instead, there was only the faint glow of slow-burning charcoal, just enough to keep fingers from freezing. The smoke smell clinging to their clothes had become a part of their bodies. They sat in circles on the ground, without ceremony or formality. Some held hands, not out of love, but because their bodies needed warmth that fire alone could not give. A woman would sometimes hum a song from her childhood, her voice hoarse and barely audible. The song was never finished, for no one remembered the lyrics anymore. But the melody lingered, like a ghost's whisper that was gentle and unthreatening. On those nights, the sound of rain felt like sympathy. As drops fell on leaf and skin rooftops, there was a sense that the outside world at least remembered they still existed. A man who had lost his sight could still remember his mother's face. A child missing fingers could still feel his sibling's embrace. In their minds, all that had been lost could return whole again. Even the smell of home, the sound of cowbells, or the taste of warm bread from a mother's kitchen. They kept all of it in a memory they dared not speak aloud, for if spoken too clearly, those memories might become new wounds. So they chose silence, a silence that was deep. A silence that healed, or at least delayed, the breaking. But rain also brought dampness that hastened rot. They welcomed it calmly, because in a place like this, even decay was part of life. The walls of their huts were made from mud and branches, and if they collapsed in the rain, they would rebuild them with their own hands. There were no complaints, no groans of despair, because no one would listen. And even if someone did, they likely wouldn't care. Those nights were also when memories arrived, like wild animals sitting silently at the edge of the bed. The next morning did not begin with a rooster's crow or the warmth of sunlight. It began with coughing. Long, dry coughs, sometimes sounding like breaking wood, came from the huts whose walls had already begun to rot. Damp and gray, like a piece of old cloth lazily hanging above the world. There were no bright colors, no rainbows, no birds singing, only a sky that seemed equally gloomy. And that was enough, because they did not need a cheerful world. The world had already left them, and they had learned not to expect more. They only asked the day to pass. That was all. One more day. One more morning. One more afternoon. They awaited nothing. No cure, no recognition, no miracle. Just continuation. No one was surprised by it. It was merely part of the daily music. When all lofty hopes had been buried with old dreams, what remained were light steps. There was no burden of ambition, no urge to be more than simply alive. And in that silence, sometimes they could hear the soft sounds of nature, a leaf falling onto wet soil, a small insect crawling beneath the grass, and their own breath trembling. The world outside might be busy with wars, politics, and treasure hunts. But behind the colony walls, what could be heard was life in its barest form, without makeup, without lies, without spotlights. Just life, beating faintly, but still moving. Then came the sound of a clay spoon tapping against a bowl, a sign that someone was trying to soften yesterday's hardened porridge. Food was no longer about taste or joy. It was a duty of survival. And like any other duty, it was done with bowed heads and slow-moving hands. No one was in a rush. There were no hurried hopes here. The sky above the colony seemed never to change. There was something both sad and peaceful in a way of life like that. But not all days were as quiet as that morning. Sometimes sounds from outside pierced through. The sound of horse hooves, the sound of royal guards, the voice of a priest praying too close to the wooden fence, as if his compassion could penetrate the deliberate isolation. There were also voices of children from far-off villages throwing stones at the colony while laughing. These sounds came and went, sometimes leaving a sting. But more often, they passed like wind. Because inside the colony, everything had slowed down. Even anger had no strength. Resentment lost its meaning when you could no longer move freely. And tears rarely came. Tears only came if hope still existed. Here, even that had faded. The people living in this colony were not monsters. They were not walking curses. They were simply bodies filled with wounds. Porridge, stale grain, water mixed with bitter herbs, but all was received with open hands. Even a piece of bread that fell to the ground would not be left behind. There was honor in accepting what was given. Because in the colony, nothing was private. Everything belonged to everyone. The wounds belonged to everyone. The sadness belonged to everyone. And in that shared existence, there grew a kind of bond the outside world did not possess. In the outside world, you could be rich and alone. Here, you were poor but watched over. A paradox that sometimes felt more honest. Skin peeling, fingers no longer whole. Faces that had lost their form, but their eyes remained the same. Those eyes could still look at the sky, could still gaze at leaves, could still hold back tears, though they seldom fell. Sometimes a child newly entered into the colony would ask if they would recover, but no one answered. Not because they did not know, but because no answer could avoid pain. Silence was the gentlest way to touch a trembling shoulder. Food, as usual, came from donations. Night arrived differently in this colony. It was not a darkness to be feared, but a stillness that felt like a deep pool in the middle of a forest. Small candles were lit, not to illuminate the whole space, but simply so that each face would not vanish from the world. Some people fell asleep quickly, their bodies too tired to stay awake. But others sat quietly, staring at the cracked earth walls. They were not waiting for anything, just absorbing the night like dry leaves absorbing the last of the dew. And in that silence, one might hear a long cough from the corner of the room, or the sound of breathing that grew slower, fainter. Death was no stranger in this place. It came slowly, walking through narrow corridors, never knocking on doors. It simply sat beside those too tired to open their eyes again. Sometimes someone would fall asleep and not wake up. Sometimes someone disappeared without a sound. There were no cries, only slow footsteps carrying a body behind the fence to a small patch of earth that had been dug the day before. Each death was a loss, but never a surprise. In the colony, loss became a steady rhythm, like the slow beating of a heart refusing to die too quickly. Yet from all that suffering, a gentleness emerged that could not be found elsewhere. Hands feeding one another, eyes still looking, even when the face had lost its form. Soft voices calling each other's names, not out of hope, but in recognition that they still existed, still real, still human. Those who had lost the outside world had instead discovered a small world within, a world whose walls were built from care, from the remnants of hope, not grand, but just enough to survive one more night. The morning was not greeted with joy. It arrived like the reopening of a wound that had not yet had time to heal. The sun slowly entered through the cracks in the walls, casting light on the dust and breath hanging in the air. One by one, bodies began to stir. Some checked their wounds, which had not improved and sometimes worsened overnight. Others tried to stand, though their joints resisted every movement. Water for washing was not always available. Sometimes it was only a damp cloth, reused and passed around. And the smell, the scent of flesh, not quite dead yet, not alive, filled the room like a mist. Each day felt like a task too heavy to continue. There was no formal work here, only the routine of survival, filling the stomach if food was present, seeking shade when the sun began to sting the sores, and sitting still when the body could bear no more. That day, an old man sat alone in the corner. He said nothing, but his eyes held something, like a memory of a home long forgotten by the world. In front of him, a small child, perhaps 7 years old, sat playing with stones. No toys, no laughter. Just two bodies sharing pain, trying to remain human. Sometimes someone from outside would come, bringing hard bread or a clean scrap of cloth tossed over the fence. No touch, no eye contact. They came as though feeding wild animals, not fellow breathing souls. But those inside the colony learned not to be angry. Anger was a burden, and there was no space left for extra weight. What they could keep was silence, and within that silence they cared for each other. Like tiny roots unseen, yet strong enough to keep the earth from collapsing. On a morning colder than usual, a cough echoed from the western corner of the colony. It was deep and heavy, as though from a chest long filled with the dust of death. An elderly woman, her body wrapped in a cloth stained dark with age and decay, slowly knelt to the ground. A few approached her, not hurriedly, but with the usual caution. Here, death did not arrive as a surprise, but rather as a guest slowly nearing. They knew, and so did she. she grasped the hand of someone beside her, perhaps her grandchild, perhaps a child of someone long gone. In a place like this, names blur and relationships shift into the bonds of shared suffering. There was no ceremony, no loud prayers, only the final exhale, and then the body was covered with a thin blanket. Outside the wall, the world continued. People ate breakfast while laughing. Children ran in their front yards. The market buzzed with chatter and bargaining. But behind the wall, a life ended without echo, as if it had never been, as if she was merely another number in the tally of the plague. And the day went on, as it always did. Yet something never died in this colony. Not the body, but the gaze. Eyes that watched without demand. They held memories of one another. They were the ones who, silently, turned each morning to make sure the person next to them was still breathing. It was a form of love unknown to the outside world, not that kind kissed or shouted, but love that is quiet, that can only grow between wounds and shame. When night fell, the colony became as silent as a forgotten cellar. Small candles were lit one by one, casting a pale yellow glow that trembled in the soft breeze. There weren't many sounds, only breathing, coughing, and occasionally the shuffle of feet. Outside, the stars hung indifferent, beautiful yet cold, like the eyes of nobles who once signed exile decrees. Night was the most honest hour in this colony. In the daylight, some still smiled. They joked or tried to sweep a yard that never truly became clean. But when night arrived, everything turned real. Fear grew between the bones, because night brought fever, and fever brought strange dreams, and sometimes death. The children who were still alive slept pressed close together. They didn't speak much. Most of them had forgotten their own names. There was a little boy who always clung to a small cloth bag, which once held toys but now carried 2 stones and a feather. It was the last thing his mother left before dying the month before. On that quiet night, he embraced the bag as though the universe was folded inside it. In silence, he cried without sound. Not out of fear, but because his small body was too tired to feel anything but a quiet longing. And in a corner of the colony, an old man sat still, looking at the sky. His eyes could hardly see any more, but he still tilted his head upward, waiting for something. Not a miracle, not medicine. Maybe just a gust of wind that blew in a new way. Or the sound of a cricket that had never sung here. He was now part of the structure itself. Not just his body, but his awareness. He had fused with the walls, the ground, and the breath of those around him. He did not speak. He simply waited. Morning in the colony never brought relief. The sun that sneaked in over the walls looked tired, as if reluctant to cast its light upon a place the world had already forgotten. There was no rooster crowing, no scent of toasted bread from any kitchen. Only the smell of damp earth, rotting wood, and human bodies that had not known soap for far too long. The first sound was the soft dragging of cloth off a body, followed by harsh coughing from 2 directions at once. It wasn't because of the cold. It's just breath after breath and hope that faded each time night returned. Sometimes a priest would visit. He wore long robes, a beak mask, and carried incense. He never touched anyone. He read prayers from a distance, then left before the colony's air clung to his robes. He was the only sign the outside world still existed, but he never brought good news. Only reminders they were still avoided, still considered unclean, still feared like demons in old folk tales. But because lungs were half broken by time and air, no longer pure, a young woman, perhaps in her 30s, rose slowly from a thin mat that had nearly become part of the ground. Her skin was still youthful, but covered in dry wounds and grayish patches. She had once been a mother, but her child was long gone, either back to God or to a noble house that bought her as a servant before realizing her mother was marked by illness. In her hand, she still held a piece of baby cloth, clutched so tightly as if letting go would collapse the memories with it. She walked to a water bucket, washed her cold and fragile face, then sat quietly against the wall, staring blankly as if waiting for the day to roll over without promise. On the other side of the colony, two old men sat with their backs to one another. They didn't speak, not out of hatred, but because they cared too much to force sound from bodies barely working. She didn't know why she did that every morning. Perhaps hoping something would fall from above. A star, maybe, or a new world. Her face was still untouched by wounds, but her eyes were far too old, as if they had seen more death and loss than her not yet 10 years should. She didn't cry, she didn't laugh. She just stood there, like a small statue carved from silence and nearly empty hope. They were once brothers, poor farmers from the same village. Now they were inmates of a world without forgiveness. One of them held a bowl of thin porridge, made of water, husks, and a pinch of salt. He ate it slowly, not because he enjoyed it, but because he knew it would be the only thing to eat that day. The porridge was cold, nearly tasteless, and closer to mud than food. But still, he ate, because even a broken body wants to live. Among the crumbling wooden buildings, a little girl stood staring at the sky. This colony had no clocks, no bells or time markers. Days changed as they pleased. Time meant nothing here. No work schedule, no party plans. In a dark corner of the colony, behind a collapsing wooden barrack, was a small group who no longer spoke to anyone. They weren't sicker than the rest. They had just run out of voice to complain and strength to be sad. In silence, they created their own sort of ritual. Every evening, they sat in a circle around a small handmade candle, not to pray, but to remember the world. One by one, they mentioned things they missed: warm wheat bread, the smell of fresh straw, the laughter of a child who had never known fear, the first rain of spring, the touch of a hand without fear. No one cried while saying these things. There were no tears left for that. But in their empty eyes, it was clear they still held a small world inside their heads, a world they would never return to. When night fell, everything froze, not just the air, but time itself. There was no campfire big enough, no hug warm enough. Only screams from a distance sometimes broke the silence, then returned to stillness. Screams whose origins were never questioned because everyone already knew the answer. Perhaps someone whose body failed to fight a fever, or a soul that finally gave in to solitude. Sometimes strange growls could be heard. Not from humans, but wild animals lurking near the walls, smelling death and hoping for scraps. No one got up to see. No one cared. Because in a place like this, nothing is scarier than tomorrow. The stone walls and wooden fences of the colony weren't just physical boundaries. They were warnings that outside, society did not want to know. That their names had been erased from prayer books, from census lists, from the hearts of those they once loved. One young woman still planted a few vegetable seeds in a small corner of dry soil. An old man tried to fix the roof of the barrack so it wouldn't tea leak when it rained. A small boy drew something in the dirt with a stick. Maybe it was a house, maybe the sun, or maybe himself without wounds. In a world that should have left no room for hope, they still kept a little of it. Not because they believed they would be healed or freed, but because humans, at their core, want to believe that even though the world has closed its doors, there is still a crack where light can get in. Those who once had families no longer received letters or news. Those who had dreams no longer remembered their shape. Even death came quietly, without bells, without ceremony. Just a shallow hole and a few handfuls of dirt. Their names were not spoken. There were no markers on graves, as if they had never existed. Yet strangely, amidst all this, life still persisted. Day after day passed without markers. No church bells, no markets, no birthdays. Time became like stagnant water, unmoving, unchanged. Once the sky was a sign, whether rain would fall, whether harvests would flourish. Villagers, young priests, or city officials curious to see what suffering looked like. They stood behind fences, covering their noses, staring as if watching a tragic play. Some cried, some turned away, but none opened the gate. They only wanted to witness, then return home and say they had seen a tragedy, that they had cared enough to visit, if only briefly. Those inside did not welcome them, did not wave. They knew that pity did not heal, and sympathetic glances did not bring bread. Now, the sky was merely a roof for endless suffering. It remained blue, remained bright, as if mocking the earth's groans. The sun kept shining. The moon still changed, as though the world was unaware of a group of people slowly vanishing from history. Even the wind felt cold, not from temperature, but because it passed without pause, as if unwilling to touch this place. Nature itself seemed to retreat, refusing to bear witness to a place long abandoned by affection. The only sign of change was the number of empty beds. Sometimes one gone, sometimes two. People didn't ask who had left. It was impolite to remember deaths without names. He did not speak, just worked with a slow but steady rhythm. Some watched him from a distance, but asked nothing. As night fell, he lit a small candle and sat at the edge of the hole. One by one, his friends came and sat with him. There was no music, no ceremony, but there was a solemnity that could not be explained. They were not mourning the dead. They were simply acknowledging death's presence. They knew the hole was not for someone who had just died, but for themselves, not because they would die that night, but because they had been dying, little by little, every day. Among the sounds of crows and creaking wooden doors, there were only faint murmurs of prayers repeated without conviction. Even God felt distant, too far to smell the rotting flesh, too grand to reach the hands that trembled. And yet, they still prayed. Not because they believed an answer would come, but because silence was even more terrifying. There was something different about how they looked at the sky. Sometimes small groups came from outside the walls, not to help, but to watch. One evening, a young man dug a hole larger than usual. In a corner of the colony stood a small building with a low roof and walls made of dried mud. It may once have stored wheat or tools, but now it served as a kind of gathering place. Inside, there were no chairs, no candles, only a few mats made of dry grass and remnants of oil lamps long extinguished. Here, those not yet too sick would sit together, speaking softly, trying to preserve something that might be called humanity. Their stories were not always about illness. Sometimes they spoke of childhood, of the taste of warm bread from the oven, of a mother's voice calling from the field. Memories became the only possessions that disease could not steal, though even those began to fade, like the colors of old fabric left too long in the sun. Some began to write on pieces of hide or on the mud walls with charred wood. They did not write to be remembered, but to fight the silence, to write so that something remained after the voice was gone. These children did not play. They only imitated adults who sat or lay staring at the sky. They were never taught to run, never saw a chicken chased, knew no shape of toys, but they knew how to hold the hand of someone dying, knew how to nod gently when asked to listen to a prayer. These children grew not for the future, but to delay the loneliness of the grown. And when they left, only a single whisper was heard. Their name once, so it would not vanish entirely. Names, places, invented dates, and prayers no one could quite remember. Outside the walls, such writing would seem meaningless. But within, each letter was proof that they had tried, that they had felt, that they had hoped. Even when the body no longer obeyed, hands still wanted to write, still wanted to freeze a moment, even if the world didn't care. One letter, one breath, one sentence, one life trying to last just a little longer. Morning always came too soon, and the first sound was coughing, a heavy, wet cough full of blood or unnameable fluid. Then the sound of water being poured from jugs into bowls. Breakfast was not called breakfast. Just boiled remains of spoiled vegetables. No taste, no fullness. But there was ritual. Lifting the bowl, sipping slowly, holding back nausea, forcing the swallow. It was not eating, it was a reminder that they were still alive, that today was not yet their turn. And after that, everyone returned to their places, sitting, silent, waiting for their turn to disappear. Children were rarely heard. Their voices were strange, softer than usual, as if not allowed to live too loudly. At night, the colony turned into a ghostly landscape. The moonlight fell on the mud buildings like a cold curtain covering wounds. Sounds became very few. Almost none. Only the wind's whisper and the sighs of those still awake from pain. Those who slept never truly slept. They merely closed their eyes and hoped not to feel their bodies. When someone began to cry softly, no one came to soothe them. That kind of crying was normal here, like rain falling at night, requiring no response. On some nights, screams echoed. Long, high-pitched screams, as if from a nightmare. But no one rose to check. Here, screams no longer called attention. They were simply signs someone was bargaining with the end. Sometimes, someone would walk at night. Not many, just one or two. Their steps were slow, dragging like shadows. They did not walk to seek anything, but because their bodies could not bear stillness. Itchy legs, heavy chests, spinning minds. One by one, buildings opened. The same faces stepped out, but no one counted who was missing. Absence was not strange here. If someone did not rise, their body might already be cold. Then two others would enter, wrap the body in a burlap sheet, and carry it to the place called the prayer pit. There was no ceremony. It's only a quiet prayer, spoken not for the soul, but for those still alive. That today was not their turn. That they still had one more night to hold on. So they circled the buildings like old monks reciting prayers in motion. Sometimes they looked up at the sky, but not in hope. Perhaps tomorrow it would be for you, or your friend, or someone who sat beside you just last night. So they began to keep distance, not from fear of contagion, but from fear of loving too closely. They began to stop speaking names, so it wouldn't hurt too much when the name disappeared. They started writing on the walls, not to be remembered, but so they wouldn't have to speak it aloud again. In a world like this, even love became silent, affection unspoken, left only in scraps of leather or whispered into sleep, only to see something that remained constant in a world collapsing around them. Those who saw this from outside the walls would only glimpse faint silhouettes, like nightmares, circling endlessly. But for those inside, it was simply a way to not explode from the silence, and morning returned again, like an unending punishment. Every grave dug carried a strange kind of fear, quote, because every hole was a possibility. Each afternoon, the sound of birds, usually the mark of life in other villages, did not exist here. Even birds avoided this place. There were no rustling leaves because there were no trees. But every day, someone cleaned wounds, fetched water, repaired leaking roofs, or simply comforted those who cried. They did not call themselves heroes. They didn't refer to each other with honorifics, yet in the silence, they held each other up. The moon appeared slowly, as if afraid to look at this place. Inside the mud buildings, people lay in silence, eyes open, not to see, but out of fear of closing them, because every sleep might be the last. But in that silence, some still held each other's hands. Some still whispered names in prayers, no longer memorized, but spoken from the body's memory. This colony was a place forgotten by the world. Yet within it, life still continued. Slowly, painfully, but real. Some had lost fingers, but still reached out to help others walk. Some could not speak, but their gaze alone was enough to soothe. They were not recorded in history, but they were the living records of endurance. This colony, with all its smell, wounds, and isolation, was also a place where kindness still emerged, even when no one asked for it. Only dry earth and low walls built from the remains of hope and mud. In the corners of the colony, small plants grew without permission. Wild grass, unaware that this place had been abandoned by life. But for those who remained, even a single green leaf could bring a deep sense of relief. Something growing meant not everything was dead. Not everything had surrendered. Those strong enough would water the grass with leftover water. Not because of grand hope, but because something within them was still alive. Something that still wanted to care, even for a single stalk growing in a crack of dirt. Work in the colony was not work as known in the outside world. No one was paid. No outcomes were collected. Once a month, someone from the outside world would come. They stood far behind a small gate and tossed cloth bags filled with medicine, dried food, or messages from families that had long stopped writing. No words were exchanged, no embraces, only eyes that met briefly and quietly. Then the gate was closed again, and what remained was a shadow. Those supplies were shared evenly, not based on who was sickest, but who hadn't received a turn. Justice in the colony did not come from power, but from a shared understanding of suffering. In a place where everything hurt, only equality made life slightly bearable. And night came again. The wind carried sharp scents of wounds and earth. Someone once wrote a poem on the mud wall, with a thin piece of charcoal. The letters were barely legible, yet the words still lived. It was a simple sentence, only one line. If no one sees us, let us see each other. And in that changelessness, time felt like it flowed slowly, like thick water, unwilling to move. There were no calendars, no celebrations. Only the vague sense that seasons were shifting because the wind felt slightly warmer, or the sky took a bit longer to darken. Children did not grow in number, for the small ones often did not survive. Those who did survive grew up in silence, their faces older than their years. But they learned from the eyes that watched them, from the quiet hands that taught without words. There was no school, but there was memory. No books, but stories passed from breath to breath, from one dirt bed to another. That line became a sort of prayer, without ceremony, without scripture. Just a faint mark on a wall slowly eroded by rain and time. Cities filled with noise, markets rich with the scent of spices, the sound of church bells. No scream, just a body that no longer moved when dawn arrived. They had no burial shroud, no coffin, only an old mat and a shallow hole in the hard earth. But when they closed that hole, someone placed a single green blade of grass on top. Not as a symbol, but as a recognition that someone had lived, that someone had endured in a place the world refused to remember. And that night, when the wind brought cold back to the colony, someone recited a poem in the corner of the room. Not for entertainment, but as a form of reverence. Like a final embrace made of words that could not be touched. All of that felt like dreams that no longer belonged to them. Now what remained were the sounds of wooden spoons against metal bowls, the heavy breathing from tired chests, and occasionally soft weeping in the corner of a room. Yet in that emptiness, they found a new form of life, a rhythm not tied to clocks, not forced by desire. Just the soft beat of existence, persisting even when no one was watching. But the people in the colony memorized it. They repeated it in their hearts when the days were too heavy or the nights too cold. That sentence became a hug that could not be physically given, a reminder that they still existed, still looked at one another, still bore witness to each other's presence in a world that had closed its eyes. The days in the colony did not change. Some still remembered the outside world, but those memories became blurry, like fog slowly fading away. One day, one of them died in their sleep. There was no sound. Those who were still alive never knew for certain whether they would see the next season. There were no doctors, no medicines, and their bodies slowly became homes for wounds that never healed. But it came thin, scruffy, and full of fleas. And as it stepped in, all eyes turned toward it. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was new. No celebrations, but loyalty. No power, but patience. Those who endured were not the strongest, but those who could love in circumstances where love seemed impossible. They cared for one another, not by law, not by duty, but because the only thing they had left to give was their presence. And in the silence, in the pain, in the ever-present death, they found something perhaps long lost in the outside world: unconditional humanity. Because something had moved from the outside to the inside. The children followed that cat everywhere. They gave it a name, fed it dry bread, even let it sleep beside them. The cat became an unintentional symbol of hope. Proof that the outside world had not completely forgotten them. And for a few weeks, laughter returned. Not loud laughter, but soft giggles that sounded like morning dew falling. Not flashy, but enough to make the night feel a little less dark. The wounds were not just on the skin, but deep within the heart. The outside world had come and taken back the one thing that felt like life. But there were no tears, no anger, only a deeper silence. As if they all understood that happiness in this place always came as a guest, never a resident, and every guest must eventually leave. That night, they kept the fire burning longer than usual, sat closer to one another, retold old stories that had been told many times before, just to keep the human voice alive among the cold walls. Grief had become routine, not a special event. Names once spoken every day gradually disappeared from conversations. Not because they were forgotten, but because saying them felt like reopening wounds that were already too painful. They learned to be silent, to stare at the small fire burning in the hearth and find comfort in the stillness. Sometimes someone would sit for hours without speaking, but no one found it strange. Silence in the colony was not a sign of despair, but the highest form of acceptance. One day, a cat entered the colony. No one knew where it came from. Perhaps lost, perhaps abandoned. But one night, the cat disappeared. No trace, no sound. And the children searched, but they knew. That colony, once thought of only as a dumping ground, had formed its own world. A world without luxury, but filled with meaning. Day by day, time felt like a tangled thread that could never be woven back together. There was no calendar they followed, no definite markers of time except for the color of the sky and the dimming flame as night arrived. Sometimes they only knew the seasons had changed from the scent of the soil or the colder air the wind carried. In his mind, he returned to a time before it all fell apart. He remembered the face of his child, the voice of his wife, the smell of the village market he used to walk through each morning. With pain, with love, with the courage to wake up each morning in a world that had rejected them. And in their isolation, they built something more lasting than monuments. A quiet understanding that life is not about grandeur, but about enduring in silence, and that true love can grow even in the most feared place on earth. Nothing could bring that past back, but nothing could take it from his thoughts either. Memory was the only possession that could not be stolen. So he sat, for a long time, letting his mind become an escape from his decaying body. No one disturbed him. In this colony, everyone understood that not all journeys require steps. Some only require silence and memory. In a world that had abandoned them, only nature still visited. And though cold and fierce, nature was the only guest that never left. The wind passing through the cracks in the walls carried sounds from outside, not voices, but time itself, reminding them that the world kept moving, even as they remained still. Inside the colony, days were lived with simple routines. They rose with the first light slipping through the leaking roof. They helped each other change bandages, prepare water, warm a thin soup that only resembled the memory of real food. There were no complaints, no hope shouted loudly, only faint smiles, sometimes blank stares that spoke more than 1,000 words. They did not live for tomorrow. They lived for this second, because in every second, someone might leave, and they had seen enough to know how thin the line between life and death truly was. So they learned to love the moment, even with sick bodies, rotting skin, and breath growing shallow. Sometimes an old man would sit in a corner, staring at the colony wall, as if he were seeing a forest or the sea. When night came, every sound became sharper. Screams from bodies that could no longer bear the pain. Soft weeping from someone who had just lost a roommate. And the quietest sound of all, the final breath, barely heard, that marked the end of another human story. But among all of that, there were also songs. Not beautiful songs from palace stages, but old tunes sung in raspy voices, simply to fill the silence. Those songs held no meaning for the outside world, but for them, they were a way to remember that they were still alive, that their voices could still reach another, even if only within the same room. They may not have been important people. They may never be remembered in history books, but they were human. Not everyone came to the colony because their bodies were covered in wounds. Some came because the outside world no longer had room for them. There was a young mother who arrived with her small daughter. They did not know the shape of cities, the color of markets, the feeling of standing in a crowd that didn't flinch at their presence. But they knew how to make dolls from straw, knew how to draw the sun with charcoal on damp walls, knew that a hug could chase away the night, a beauty from flowers, music, or color, but a beauty that appears only when people remove all their masks. In this colony, no one pretended to be happy, but neither did anyone pretend to be strong. Everyone existed in their most honest form. And perhaps that's why, behind the thick veil of sorrow, there was a comfort that could not be found outside. Because nowhere else were people this honest. Nowhere else was suffering not hidden. And that is where the purest humanity lay. In wounds that were not denied. In embraces that felt no shame. In tears allowed to fall without needing a reason. They laughed not because they were unaware of suffering, but because they knew it too well. Laughter for them was not an escape, but a form of resistance. And the world beyond the walls seemed crueler than this small, wounded colony. Here, at least, everyone knew what it was like to be hated. And in shared hatred, they found a kind of love that the normal world never taught them. She did not suffer from leprosy, had no spots on her skin, no foul odor from her body. But her husband had been burned by villagers who believed he carried a curse. And because she was the wife of a cursed man, no home would take them in. So she came to the colony not with hope, but because it was the only place where people did not ask questions, did not judge. Here, she sat beside a creaky old bed and told stories to her daughter. Not from books, but from memory. Tales of trees that could talk and rivers that could laugh. In a colony where the scent of death was so familiar, a mother's storytelling voice became a more potent remedy than any potion. Children grew up here without knowing what the outside world was. When rain fell, no one danced. Rain wasn't romantic to them. It was cold, creeping into bones, moisture rotting the straw beds. But still, no one cursed the sky. They only bowed their heads, tightened their cloaks, and shared warmth by sitting closer. No prayers pleaded for the rain to stop. Only small whispers comforted one another. Rain was a part of the world, and they were too tired to fight the world. They chose to accept it. Not out of resignation, but because they knew a life that can accept pain is the strongest kind of life. Amid all this bitterness, a kind of beauty grew that could not be explained. Eventually, a night would come when the colony was so quiet that even the sound of bats felt like a lullaby. There were no footsteps, no coughs, only the sigh of wind slipping through the cracks of weathered boards and crumbling bricks. But their stories lived on, not in writing, but in whispers, in remembering eyes, in touches that still held the warmth of those who had passed. An old man once said that this place was not a curse, but a door to true honesty. In the outside world, people race to look perfect, hiding sores behind fine clothes and sweet words. But here, all the wounds were visible, and because of that, they could truly understand each other. There was no need to pretend anymore. No competition to appear strong. Only human beings bare in their wounds and hopes. Nights like these felt long, because no one was sure if they would wake up the next morning. But like everything the world throws away, life found a new shape within them. Kings were replaced, wars erupted, cities burned, but none of it reached their ears. Time stood still here, and the greater world seemed to forget they existed. Yet strangely, it was in this forgotten place that the truest side of humanity endured. When the world chose to forget them, they chose not to forget each other. and with that, they survived. Not because of medicine, not because of miracles, but because of small love that grew in soil no one believed could grow anything. They planted wildflowers, not to sell, but to remember. They made music from spoons tapping against tin plates, not for entertainment, but to remember laughter. They built altars from stone, not to seek salvation, but so rejected prayers had a place to land. And perhaps that was the most painful part. Not the wounds on the body, not the isolation, but the fact that in a world claiming to be holy, there were still so many prayers left without a home. Not because the disease killed swiftly, but because living in the colony was a slow process of losing. One by one, those who once sat at the edge of the bed sharing stories or dry bread would suddenly disappear. There were no grand funerals, no wailing cries, just a folded cloth and an empty spot on the dirt floor. Even death became something quiet here, like an oil lamp slowly fading as it runs out of breath. Some of them were never named by history. No gravestones, no records in church books. Leper colonies were never meant to be homes. They were built as places of disposal. And beyond the walls of this colony, history marched on in a rush. There was one night that none who lived through it could ever forget. A night when the rain fell like the thunderous voice of God pounding on clay roofs and banana leaves sewn together to patch the windholes. Here, she slept on dry straw mixed with ash. There were no children calling her mother. No tiny hands gripping her fingers during fevered nights. But in her final sleep, her lips smiled. Perhaps in her dream, she returned to that time. 2 tall wheat fields, the scent of warm bread and laughter, untouched by fear. And when her body finally stopped moving, they covered her with cloth, and there was no screaming, no theatrics. Only silence, a silence deeper than night. A silence that held everything words could not. The colony was lit by a single torch, and behind a curtain of thin cloth came a faint singing voice trembling in loneliness. He had no shovel, only a wooden board that once belonged to a wall. He did not cry, but his hands trembled as he closed the earth again. He knew that one day it would be his place too. But still, he dug. Still, he buried. Still, he stayed. Because in a world full of abandonment, the presence of another at our final moment is the greatest gift one human can offer to another. It was not a beautiful song, but a hoarse one, worn down by throat sores and thinning lungs. Those who could not touch outsiders learned to touch each other's hearts. Those who had lost their voice became the best listeners. Those who could not leave built a small world within the walls, a world filled with scraps, but also with poetry, memory, and love that asked for no perfection. And with that, they endured. Day after day, night after night. Even though the stench never left. Even though rats continued to run between their feet. Even though bodies decayed before their time, they endured. And perhaps because of that, it sounded like a prayer. In that voice lived a longing for childhood, for home, for an embrace. And when the wind turned the flame into a shadow that danced across the stone walls, Everyone in the room knew it was a night of farewell. She, a woman who had once been the mother of 3 children, had lived in a house surrounded by wheat fields. The next day, a young man dug into the earth at the corner of the colony, a place long used as a nameless graveyard. In this colony, no one was truly alone, even if they all came because they were left behind. There is a silence that comes not from the absence of sound, but from exhaustion. In the final days, those who still breathed spoke little. Time became liquid, like the thin soup they shared in wooden bowls. Not enough to fill the stomach, but enough to keep life moving. They ate without taste, slept without dreams, and woke without hope. But still, they woke. Because the body still lived, and as long as the body lived, there was something to do. Like cleaning someone else's wound, or lighting a small fire for boiling water, or simply sitting beside someone who was leaving. Words became burdens for what more could be said when everything was lost. Maybe it was just a tale to calm the heart. But in this colony, such stories were the only reason to stay alive, to not give up, to sit beside another's bed and wait until the final breath stopped. No family ever came. No priest offered a touch. Not the kind sung about by noble poets or whispered in palace gardens, but love in its simplest and purest form. Love in the shape of the last piece of bread given away, in the tearing of old cloth so another could be warm. Love that had no fragrance and spoke no sweet words, but love that endured even when skin began to rot and names were forgotten. Love that said, I am here with you, until the end, until it is over, until there is nothing left to give except presence. But a fellow sufferer stayed, and perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was even more sacred. In this colony, silence was the truest language. A pair of eyes meeting at dawn spoke more than 1,000 sentences. Circling trembling hands, landing on eyelids not fully shut, dancing atop wounds that could no longer be healed. But people adapted as they had to the smell, to the darkness, to coughing up blood, to the cries that echoed through the night. All of it became part of life. Not a shock, not something to cry over. Just ... part of the day. Like the sun that rises and falls. Like shadows that come when the torches go out. A weak hand clasp, not strong, but enough to remind each other that something of humanity still survived in a place the world deemed unworthy. Some began to forget what day it was. They no longer knew whether it was Monday or Friday, whether spring had come or winter still lingered. There was a story going around that if someone died with a friend beside them, their soul would not be lost. The flies never left. Even when bodies were burned, they still came. And in all of that, there was love. Outside the colony walls, the world went on as usual. Kingdoms still stood. Markets still opened. Children still played in streets far from here. But they didn't know, or chose not to know, about the decaying life behind these walls. The sound was clear, yet it felt foreign. It was the voice of a world they once knew, but no longer belonged to. Those living in this colony had no place in public prayers. Their names weren't spoken at feasts. No sign of the cross adorned their doors. Here, there was no status, no wealth, no beauty, or good name. What remained was the truth of being human. Fragile bodies, hearts capable of sorrow, and the ability to give even when there was nothing left. Here, people learned to love unconditionally, to accept unconditionally, and to die not in fear, but in understanding that they had lived, that they had loved, that they had once belonged to the world, even if the world refused to claim them. Even their deaths went unrecorded, their bodies burned or quickly buried. No gravestones, no mourning families, only dirt and silence, and perhaps a low-flying bird witnessing the end of a life that was never wanted to begin with. Walls not only made of stone, but of fear and denial, as if by not seeing, the suffering would cease to exist, as if lepers were not human beings, but symbols of sin or curses. And so they were confined, hidden, forgotten. Sometimes the sound of a church bell rang in the distance. Yet even in separation, not all forgot. There was a small child who quietly came to the colony gate, placing a piece of bread wrapped in leaves. The child never entered, only bowed, then ran back into the woods. No one knew who it was. But each week, the bread returned, perhaps from a mother who once lost a brother, perhaps from a heart that could not entirely deny love. That bread was shared, and though small, it felt like a celebration, like a message that somewhere out there, a soul remembered, that they were not yet entirely erased from the world. This colony, with all its rot and pain, slowly became a place of value not found in palaces. Time inside the colony did not pass as it did outside. Days were not marked by activity, but by the arrival and departure of lives. No one wanted to see their own reflection slowly disappearing, but by holding the hand of someone who was trembling, by sitting quietly beside the one waiting for death, by folding up their own blanket and placing it over someone colder. This was the language of the colony, a silent language understood only by those who no longer hoped. But for that reason, it was more honest. No pleasantries, no pretending. Just presence and farewells flowing wordlessly. Their faces changed not with time, but with disease. Prayers unanswered by the world. Yet prayers still whispered each night, like lullabies for fragile hearts. For in this colony, miracles weren't measured by recovery or death, but by the ability to continue loving a world that did not love them back. And that, perhaps, was the quietest miracle of all. Skin was no longer identity, but a sign the body was surrendering. Sometimes they glanced at water in a basin, catching a fleeting image of themselves, then looked away. For even water could no longer reflect the humanity that was fading. They looked at one another, not to judge, but to remember, staring as if memorizing before forgetting. The sun could rise 1,000 times, but if one friend was gone, that day felt hollow. They did not mark dates nor light clocks. They only knew morning by the dying of fire, and night by the coughing that would not stop. The outside world lived by seasons and celebrations. Their world lived from one final embrace to the next, from one heartbeat weakening to the next, even fainter. There were no mirrors in the colony. There was no need. And though voices often failed, they still spoke. Not with words. Some still believed they would heal. Perhaps because of dreams. Perhaps because of faith. They wrote prayers with charcoal on the walls. Prayers not requested by the church. Morning arrived not with light, but with scent. Damp smoke from burning wet wood. The smell of watery soup that barely held substance, and most sharply, the scent of human bodies no longer able to care for themselves. Only hugged a worn-out doll, made from stitched scraps of cloth. People said she was once a mother. Perhaps she had a child. Perhaps the doll was a replacement for a tiny body she once held. No one knew for certain, but no one dared take the doll from her, because everyone understood. In this place, the only true possessions were memories. And memories, though faded and dusty, were the final form of love they had. They did not reject that smell. They lived with it. Not because of sounds or light, but because of a deeper silence. The chirping of insects sounded like prayer. The sighing of breath became lullabies. And the stars in the sky felt too distant, as if they belonged only to the healthy. Sometimes someone would cry out in their sleep, call a name, moan, or simply whisper for their mother. No one woke them, because everyone understood dreams were the only place they could return home. Back to being someone once loved, before disease claimed it all. Because in the colony, to smell another's body was to know they were still alive. Frightening, perhaps, how low hope could settle. But that was how they endured. By accepting what could not be changed and loving whatever remained. There was an old woman who sat each morning beneath a dead tree in the colony's yard. She never spoke. At night, the colony became another world. And even on days when none of them wished to rise, they still rose. Because in the colony, waking was not about motivation. It was about loyalty. Loyalty to those still living. To those still waiting. To those still able to receive an embrace, even if their skin had begun to crack. This was not a life of dignity, but it was still life. And they chose to live it, not because of hope, but because of love that no longer had form, but still carried breath. Sometimes someone would come bearing news from beyond, a monk or a kind soul from an untouched town. In this colony, no one was called by baptismal names anymore, but about food that did not rot, beds that weren't wet, and clothes that did not stick to wounds. The world they heard about sounded like a small paradise. But no one wanted them to know more, because once they knew what they were missing, they would grow with a hollowness sharper than the sores on their skin. They were named after wounds, age, or quirks. There was Coughing Man, Three Fingers, and the Swearing Mother. And strangely, those names became their final beloveds, because true names were too heavy to speak, too bound to a life now like a beautiful nightmare. They were no one now, and in that there was freedom. A painful but real kind of freedom. He would stand far outside the gate, his voice carried by wind, and his eyes hiding something he dared not speak. He would tell them the world outside still moved, that the church bells still rang, small soft but real. Sometimes from a child who found a beetle beneath a stone. Sometimes from a woman laughing as a bird pecked stale bread. Sometimes from a man who managed to sing an old song without coughing. That laughter was not about joy. It was about the courage to still feel, even when the world had died around them. And perhaps there lay their true strength. Not in bodies resisting disease, but in hearts that refused to freeze. That the seasons changed, though they had no windows left to see them. But such news did not bring joy. It often wounded instead. For it reminded them they had been erased from the map of hope, from the list of souls still counted. But not only their bodies were exiled, their names too had vanished. Children born here grew without knowing the outside world. They knew it through stories, and those stories were not about kingdoms, heroes, or angels. And strangely, amidst all this ruin, there was laughter. When night fell, everything turned quieter than death. The sky, once full of stars, now only a sheet of gray darkness. There were no lanterns, no flames. But because speaking to oneself felt more honest than talking to a world that never replied. They asked whether God heard cries from behind quarantine walls. Whether prayers still rose if whispered from broken lips. Whether angels would come to a place even humans dared not look at. Those questions were never answered. Yet they kept being asked. And maybe that was the final form of worship left to these caged souls. Save for tiny embers clutched tightly in filthy hands. Sometimes pale blue, like a body that no longer breathed. The air still carried the damp stench of decay. The smell of wounds, of sweat. Not hunger, but the feeling of being forgotten. The outside world did not want to know, often pretended the colony never existed. Letters from the church sometimes arrived, but more often held commands than comfort. Nobles would not speak of them. Physicians no longer came, and priests only raised hands from afar. In that silence, they became shadows, not people, not stories. Just faint marks in history, written with ink of fear, and of bodies slowly breaking apart. Yet still, they rose. They washed their faces with water no longer clear. They adjusted their ragged clothes that had fused with their skin. They looked at each other, wordless, and walked outside like actors in a play with no audience. For even if the day was the same, and the suffering remained, there was a sort of promise in routine. It's a promise that as long as they could still stand, they were not yet defeated. Night in the colony was not a time for sleep, but a time for listening. There were moans. There were gasps. There were wordless cries, like souls speaking without mouths. And from afar, sometimes the sound of earth being dug could be heard. No funeral bells, no procession. If someone died that night, they would be taken away in silence. For here, death was not a grand event. It was routine, like cleaning wounds or measuring porridge. Some of them began talking to themselves, not out of madness. In the morning, the sky sometimes turned red like a wound. And among all that ruin, there was one thing that hurt most, not the pain in their flesh. Night came as usual, without sound, without warning, only the sky slowly losing its color. In the colony, night was not merely darkness. It was a curtain that closed unfinished stories, unspoken sorrow, and longing that could never be sent. When cries could no longer be held back and breathing felt heavier than usual. Nights when a small child cried, not from pain, but because he had forgotten his mother's face. In a place like this, time was a slow poison that ate away memories bit by bit, making everything hazy and unfamiliar. There were no mirrors in the colony. No one wanted to see their own face. No one wanted to see the wounds that now defined who they were. They didn't sleep because they were tired, but because the world no longer gave a reason to stay awake. Sleep became the most peaceful escape, a place where the body no longer felt pain, and memories faded like thin morning mist. Yet there were nights when the wind was too cold and the roof too thin. Sometimes, behind walls of wood and mud, a faint voice of prayer could be heard. A prayer not for healing, but for peace. Not to return home, but to be accepted. Because they knew the world would not open its doors. The world had chosen to forget. No tales of dramatic rescues or miracles descending from the sky. Only ordinary people, wiping each other's sweat, sharing the last drops of water, or sitting together in silence. Togetherness in loneliness. And it was precisely in such a quiet place, amid the smell of wounds and slowly decaying bodies, that a tiny spark of something profoundly human could be found. Gentleness, sincerity, resilience. So they prayed not for the world to change, but for their hearts not to freeze completely. That there might still be a small space in their chests to store love, even if it was only for fellow colony dwellers. In that colony, there were no heroes. Sometimes there were sounds from afar. Not human voices, but the faint ringing of a bell from the nearby monastery. A sound that once brought hope, now merely a reminder that the outside world still existed. Still lived in cleanliness and acceptance. In the colony, sounds from outside were like dream shadows, distant but painful, reminding them that they were once part of that world. Before the spots appeared, before the skin peeled, before their names were erased from baptism records and family memories. Children grew up not knowing what it felt like to be hugged. Some of them couldn't even remember the first and last embrace they ever received. Hugging was a luxury no longer possible. Rain brought no fertility. Only mud and cold. Roofs leaked, floors turned to puddles. Wounds became moist and gaped wider. There was no medicine except time, and time was never kind in a place like this. Many of them no longer feared death, but feared being forgotten while still alive. Afraid that after their bodies were buried in unmarked mass graves, not a single name would be remembered, not a single story recalled. As bodies were seen as cursed when the sky was so clear that stars appeared sharp and someone played a handmade bamboo flute. Music gently slipped through the pain, making the night feel for a moment not like a punishment, but a resting place. In the colony, they learned to find beauty in small things. A single falling leaf. A smile from lips barely able to part. A tiny flame that survived the entire night, and touch considered a path to death. So they looked at each other from a distance, comforting one another with whispered stories, with eyes that spoke more than mouths. In the silence and cramped space, love still sought a form, even if it could not manifest as an embrace. The rainy season was the most painful. Yet there were also quiet moments. Because they knew life didn't have to be grand to be meaningful. Even in a place shunned by the world, life still moved forward. Perhaps slowly, in broken rhythms, but still real. And they, the inhabitants of the colony, were silent proof of the human ability to endure. Amid the stench, isolation, and nameless deaths, they continued to face the morning, with small hopes, with hearts not yet fully extinguished. There came a time when even time seemed to stop. A moment that often came in the dead of night, when the wind no longer whispered and only the sound of footsteps could be heard. In moments like that, the colony felt quieter than usual. There were no laughs, no whispers, only silence that seemed to grow heavier. Those who still remained there, those who could still hear clearly despite their frail bodies, knew that tonight would be the last for some of them. The night that brought them closer to something more eternal. Outside, life continued. People who never knew of the existence of the colony went on with their routines. They went to church, worked, farmed, celebrated the seasons in their own ways. But inside the colony, all they could do was remember how far they were from that world. A world that was supposed to still hold hope, still have chances. They no longer saw the future. They simply lived day by day, reminding themselves that each breath was a gift, though heavy, though unfair. The children in the colony didn't know what was happening outside. They didn't know about wars or about the seasons coming and going. They heard about gardens full of flowers, about rivers flowing clear and uninterrupted, about how people used to move freely, walk without fear. But these stories were more than just tales. To the children, they were reminders that even though they were trapped, even though their bodies were bound by illness, their minds could still soar to places farther, to a world far greater than the colony that confined them. They only knew one thing. They lived with pain and they lived with hope, though that hope was gradually fading. Yet there was something still within them, a curiosity that had not fully gone out, even as their world grew smaller. They asked about the sun, about the sea, and sometimes about the stars they occasionally saw in the dark sky. There were no adequate answers, only stories from their parents' mouths that were slowly fading. One of the stories often told was about the vast world, about life before the sickness came. There came a time when even time seemed to stop. A moment that often came in the dead of night, when the wind no longer whispered and only the sound of footsteps could be heard. In moments like that, the colony felt quieter than usual. There were no laughs, no whispers, only silence that seemed to grow heavier. Those who still remained there, those who could still hear clearly despite their frail bodies, knew that tonight would be the last for some of them. The night that brought them closer to something more eternal. Outside, life continued. People who never knew of the existence of the colony went on with their routines. They went to church, worked, farmed, celebrated the seasons in their own ways. They didn't know about wars or about the seasons coming and going. They only knew one thing. They lived with pain and they lived with hope, though that hope was gradually fading. Yet there was something still within them, a curiosity that had not fully gone out, even as their world grew smaller. They asked about the sun, about the sea, and sometimes about the stars they occasionally saw in the dark sky. There were no adequate answers, only stories from their parents' mouths that were slowly fading. But inside the colony, all they could do was remember how far they were from that world. A world that was supposed to still hold hope, still have chances. They no longer saw the future. They simply lived day by day, reminding themselves that each breath was a gift, though heavy, though unfair. The children in the colony didn't know what was happening outside. One of the stories often told was about the vast world, about life before the sickness came. They heard about gardens full of flowers, about rivers flowing clear and uninterrupted, about how people used to move freely, walk without fear. But these stories were more than just tales. To the children, they were reminders that even though they were trapped, even though their bodies were bound by illness, their minds could still soar to places farther, to a world far greater than the colony that confined them. A few days before the season changed, the fog from the mountains arrived earlier than usual. It covered the colony like a massive veil, not soothing, but suffocating. No light could pierce it. No sound could pass through. Allah. The world seemed to shrink to only a few steps from where one's feet stood. Ha! And within that fog, people lost one another. One by one, disappeared. For realizing that in the place most hated by the world, there was the most unconditional love. For realizing that you had wasted your life on things that didn't matter. For realizing that the most broken humans could become the brightest lights in the world, as darkest places. Not because they died, but because they got lost, even in a place so small. Someone walked to the well and never returned. Another went to find firewood and vanished. No one shouted, because even voices drowned in that nameless white ash. Then, on the fifth night, the fog turned into rain. But not like the first rain they had once deemed sacred. This rain was cold and harsh. It lashed the broken roofs and the hanging cloth like whips. She was too young to understand the meaning of quarantine, but old enough to know that her mother could no longer rise. She did not cry. Crying only hastened the exhaustion. She simply worked. Her small hands peeled the root skin, sliced it thin, and waited for it to dry so it could be fried over embers. No one told her to. She just knew. Because in the colony, no one needed to be told to survive. Everyone moved because of a love that was never taught. It reopened wounds that hadn't yet healed. It made old bones ache and tremble. But they endured. They always endured. Even if the world had to test them through fog, rain, piercing winds, or a silence that rolled like an ancient sea. In the corner of the kitchen where the fire was always faint, a little girl sat splitting roots. Those who remained in the colony were not merely sufferers. They were the guardians of the final ember of humanity. Among the stench, the pain, and the exile, they proved that the human soul could still be warm. They laughed softly when nights would not let them sleep. They touched weak hands gently, not out of fear, but out of respect. They gave their last spoon of soup to the weaker ones, knowing that tomorrow they themselves might not still be there. There were no heroes here. But behind the sores and pus, there was courage purer than any sword or crown. If you had ever stood among them, you would not speak. You would remain silent. Not out of fear, but out of shame. The next morning, the sound of a small gong was struck, not for celebration, not for prayer, but to mark that someone had passed. In this colony, death was no longer a grand sorrow. It became routine, like a season that arrived uninvited. The residents stepped out from their cold beds, stood silently with bowed heads, then returned without a word. There were no long ceremonies. The soil there was not fertile, but soft enough to be dug with a shovel inherited from the man before him, who also died coughing blood. The hole was not deep, just enough so the smell would not spread too quickly. They covered it gently, not with a gravestone, but with a branch tied with tattered cloth. A quiet marker for anyone who wished to remember. No sobbing cries. Only one pillow, now empty. One corner of the kitchen, quieter. A silence that understood death was not the end, only a continuation of something beyond words. They walked home slowly, passing the wooden fence, passing the rats that now dared to come out in daylight. The outside world might see them as defeated, but inside there was a kind of maturity that could not be learned from books or sermons. It could only be born from shared suffering, and one name that slowly faded from memory, like dew never claimed by the afternoon. The one who died that day was an old man once known for his stories. He had made children laugh, lent his last piece of bread to a nursing mother, once sang when the rain lasted too long. But his body could not withstand the fever that came during the last rainy season. In 2 nights, he shrank like a candle. And that morning, he no longer moved. There was no doctor, no examination. Just breath that stopped, and cold that lingered too long at the tips of his fingers. He was wrapped in the cleanest blanket they had, then carried by 2 young men to a small hole that had been prepared since the previous month. The most moving part was how they were silent. A silence not of anger, not of anxiety. They did not hope to be cured, did not demand miracles. They only wanted the next day to arrive without too much loss. They asked for little. Just a fire that stayed lit. Just a piece of bread enough to share. Just one more hand to hold when the night grew cold. And if they could not have even that, they would still breathe. Because that was the only wealth they had left. Night came again with a soft step, almost inaudible. Fog slowly crept from the damp earth, slipping through the cracks in the wooden walls, wrapping the colony in a deeper silence. No one spoke. No one asked questions. Dreams were never spoken aloud. They remained behind eyes that closed too quickly. Someone once dreamed of becoming a painter. Another wanted to open a bakery. Gentle, not because they had given up, but because they knew violence could save no one. They learned to live with silence, learned to love within limitations, learned to die without bitterness. The outside world might see them as shadows, but here they lit each other up. In almost total darkness, they were small candles that refused to go out. One had wished to walk across the mountains to see the sea for the first time, but now all dreams were reduced to one small hope: that no one would die tomorrow, that the air would not be too cold tonight, that the stench would not be too strong in the morning. These little hopes whispered from one room to another like voiceless prayers. Everyone knew that night always brought shadows darker than the day before. Some bodies lay down earlier, not out of fatigue, but because their strength could no longer bear the weight of age and illness gnawing from within. Small candle flames in each room flickered gently like lives waiting for their turn. In the next room, a little girl shivered in her mother's arms. She was not a leper, not yet. An old man sat alone. He did not eat dinner. Not because there was no food, but because his stomach had long become used to emptiness. He stared at the small, fogged window, trying to recall the shape of the moon. He wondered, was someone else out there also sitting in silence like him, perhaps in a warm house, with a cup of milk and a clean blanket? Did anyone remember that behind this wall, humans still dreamed? Even if only briefly, even faintly, they still dreamed, eh? But a faint red line had started to appear on her hand, eh? The mother knew what it meant, but held her tightly anyway. As if warmth could erase destiny. The outside world might have forgotten them, but love did not vanish so easily. In a place like this, affection became the final form of rebellion, a small defiance against fate that sought to erase every trace of humanity. In the kitchen, inside this colony, yet in that pain, their strength grew. They did not become weak. They became gentle. Morning arrived like a secret no one wanted to greet. There were no bird songs, no crowing roosters. Only the whisper of wind brushing against straw and the sighs of bodies yet to rise from their worn mats. The smell of dampness and decaying flesh became an inescapable scent, seeping into everything the air touched. And as usual, there was one door that no longer opened. Someone had departed quietly, leaving the colony without ceremony, without tears, only with a blanket pulled up to cover the face. People did not scream. They did not revolt. They accepted, and in that acceptance, they found a kind of peace that the healthy outside the walls might never know. Perhaps it was because when everything is stripped away, there is nothing left to fear. Perhaps it is because when you know the end is near, you begin to love the simple things. A breath that does not hurt. Light falling on your hand. The name of someone you can still call before you sleep. There was no death bell, no procession. Death here was not a grand event. It came like a long sleep, understood by all, but never spoken of. The colony workers arrived with slow steps, bringing wooden boards and rope. They wore no masks over their noses, because after a few weeks, every smell became ordinary. They simply bowed respectfully, then carried the body behind the old building, where the ground was already full of shallow graves. No names were recorded. Only a small stone placed on top of the mound. Not to remember, but just to avoid stepping on it. On the other side of the colony, an old woman sat under the faint morning light. Her hands trembled, but she kept knitting. The yarn was dirty and tangled, but she knitted not to create something. She knitted to remember that time still passed, that she had not completely disappeared. Across from her, a young man played with two small stones, placing them one by one on his palm. A small game that meant nothing, except to chase away the fear that he too would soon be like the others. And among them all, there was always one who remained silent. He did not cry, did not speak, never left his small room. People called him the Quiet One, even though he had once been a street singer whose voice could make crowds stop in the middle of the market. But here, there was no market, no song. He only sat, watching the sky through a crack in the roof, waiting to see if today would be different, but it never was. Just another morning that came and went and erased one more of them. Yet the strange miracle of this place was not its suffering, but the calm that slowly grew within it. Night fell slowly, like a heavy curtain covering all wounds. The colony had no lights. Light came only from the stars and occasionally from a small fire lit in the corner, just enough to warm hands or boil murky water deemed safe enough to drink. Inside were two buttons, a piece of paper that once bore a prayer, and a strand of hair he had saved from his wife before being sent to this colony. He didn't know if his wife was still alive, but every night he opened that pouch, stared at its contents in silence, then closed it again and slept holding it against his chest. It wasn't a song of hope, nor of the future. No grand philosophies. Just silence shared together. Because sometimes what people need most isn't an answer, but presence. Someone who sits beside you and doesn't leave. Someone just as sick perhaps, but still here, with you, inside the walls the world has deemed unworthy. But of resilience, of how humans endured even when there was no longer any reason to stand. Of fragile bodies that still moved, of wounded hearts that still made room for a little laughter, even if just for a moment, even if only. Because a rat slipped in the corner of the room. To the outside world, these were just worthless scraps. But for the old man, they were the last bridge between himself and something once called life. The sound of crickets and the rustling wind became the music that accompanied their sleep, and often distant screams were part of that symphony. No one searched for the source of the sound. Everyone already knew was just another soul that had finally surrendered to their own body. Inside a small room, an old man held a small cloth pouch. Not far from him, a small child coughed softly. His mother rubbed his back, though her own fingers had already begun to blacken. They had no medicine, no great hopes. But in that small gesture of rubbing, there was a love deeper than any miracle. A love that endured poverty, the stench of death, and bodies rejected by society. A love that asked for nothing in return, only to stay beside one another until the true end arrived. Meanwhile, the outer wall of the colony stood silent. No guards. No signs the world cared. Outside, cities were busy again. Merchants traded. Priests preached. Kings waged wars. But no one came to this colony, as if, to the world, the people within those walls had long been dead. Only their names never spoken, and their stories never written. Yet from within this colony, there was a kind of silent song that couldn't be heard by ordinary ears. And on certain nights, when the sky was truly clear, some of them would sit close together, gazing at the stars. There was no discussion of fate or salvation. Morning comes as always, but brings little change. The air is still cold and thin, the sun only faintly reflecting on the rough walls that enclose their lives. There are no crowing roosters, no scent of bread baking, only the sour and damp smell of earth that never truly dries. Sometimes it is thin porridge made from spoiled grain, sometimes just boiled water with wild grass. There are no plates, no spoons. They drink straight from cracked clay vessels. Some cry, some remain silent, as if even tears are too precious to waste. In this colony, even weeping feels like a luxury. One by one, the residents rise from their half-conscious sleep. Not because they are rested, but because their bodies can no longer lie still. Pain makes them move. It is a life that continues, despite having no reason to. A breath forced in and out, a heartbeat that keeps beating not from will, but because it has not yet stopped. And behind all that suffering, there is one lesson that can only be learned in silence. That humans, when faced with the deepest darkness, often still find a flicker of light in the simplest form. Hunger makes them open their eyes. Children, still young enough to walk, are soon directed to the corner where leftover food is distributed. A young man with only one hand and a face scarred from old wounds sits under a dead tree. He makes small toys from scraps of wood and gives them to passing children. There are no wide smiles from the children, just puzzled looks or quick glances. But he continues to make them every day. He does not sell them. He does not even know why. But perhaps he just wants to remember that he can still create. That even though the world has decided he is useless, his heart is not yet fully dead. There is a woman who once served as a nurse in a monastery. Her hands tremble now, but her spirit still tries to care for those who can be cared for. There they are, buried in silence. No bells, no formal prayers. Just a few who accompany, bowing briefly, then returning to the day as if the loss were just another part of the routine. Perhaps it is. Here, death is not an extraordinary event. It is simply another piece of time. She walks from one person to another, checking wounds, changing bandages made from old cloth, and muttering prayers in forgotten Latin. No one tells her to. No one pays her, but she walks every morning as if it were her personal path of penance. In others' suffering, she finds the remaining reason to keep living. Each day, someone does not wake up. And when that happens, they are taken to a corner of the colony known as the Silent Ground. Yet behind all that bitterness, there still burns a spark of humanity that somehow refuses to die out. Life in this colony is not about winning or losing, not about hope soaring or miracles coming to save. And behind the quarantine walls filled with wounds and silence, the 14th century leper colony still holds a story too often forgotten. That suffering never fully kills humanity, and that love, even when wrapped in its roughest form, still finds a way to live. There is no happy ending here, no miracle that cures all, but there are those who choose to stay alive. They lived because they were not yet dead, and for some people, that alone is already a miracle. There are hands that still tend to wounds, voices that still pray, even with no one to hear. There are souls who still believe, not in salvation, but in meaning. You might not last even a single night in this place. The stinging stench, the peeling flesh, and the stiff smiles shaped by pain would break the courage of anyone who's only known comfort. But if you're willing to pause, if you're willing to hear the whispers echoing through these quiet halls, you will learn one truth no history book ever teaches, that those who are cast out are sometimes the most human. That those who have lost everything understand best the value of one more heartbeat. They lived not to be remembered, not to be glorified,